somehow they transcend into tragedy.
Good afternoon, friends. My name is Daniel Watkins, and welcome back to Between the Dial, a project where we attempt to plot a long, strange roadmap through the dark heart of Los Angeles, in hopes of uncovering a hidden geography that sits right atop our own. And for the next few weeks, all roads will lead us right here, to the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Which will be nice on a day like today, because we are right now in the worst part of the dog days of summer. The doldrums, the Charles Manson-y part of the summer, if you know what I mean. And if you don't, well, maybe we'll talk about it sometime, but that story is not this story. And why would we want to talk about Charles Manson in a place as beautiful as this? In fact, with all its old Hollywood charm, I feel like Charles Manson would have hated it here. But back to the beauty. Let's drive through the gate and wind our way to the crown jewel of the cemetery, the Garden of Legends. You'll know it when you see it, believe me. The ornate graves and pond full of waterfowl are, forgive me, a dead giveaway. But do drive slowly, because there are over 40 peacocks who call this cemetery home. And they walk the streets just as they do in the grass, rightly so, like they own the place. Once you get to the pond, pull over. We'll get out there. Around this time of day, you may hear the squawk of a flock of parrots overhead on their way back to Pasadena. You may also be wondering what's so special about this place, as opposed to, say, Forest Lawn or any of the other cemeteries in Los Angeles, all of which boast a pretty impressive roster of celebrity interred. Well, as I said in the intro, I think it comes down to the theatricality of the place. There is a performative nature to these monuments. For instance, did you not see the statue of Johnny Ramone on the drive-in, literally in mid-performance? There's a performative nature that feels as though Hollywood is trying to make just as much a show of death as it does of life. In fact, they hold movie screenings on the Fairbanks lawn to our right, in which they literally project films onto the wall of the cathedral mausoleum. It's the same magic trick they've been doing since the very beginning. Look at the woman in the sparkling gown and pay no attention to her double, skulking off into the shadows. It's a place that exists as it does because Hollywood has always been more comfortable writing and rewriting its own history, rather than leaving it to the civilians who always seem to ask such pesky questions. I guess in this case that would be us. Now, if you've followed me on one of these little trips before, then you know we always try to start at the very beginning. Context is everything, as they say. So before we get out of the sun, let's take a walk to the lawn opposite the Garden of Legends, and stop once we get to roughly the center. we will see a large, dark stone bearing the name of our first subject, Price. This cemetery was built in 1899, back when Hollywood was mostly a patchwork of citrus groves. The population at that time was roughly around 500 people, and the town was still about 11 years away from being incorporated into Los Angeles proper. The land was originally owned by Mary Gower, who, in addition to having a vast homestead, was also Hollywood's first school teacher. The cemetery was born when she sold 100 acres of her property to a businessman from Nebraska named F.W. Samuelson, who established the Hollywood Cemetery Association along with a few reoccurring characters like Isaac Newton Van Nuys and his father-in-law and fellow Isaac Lankershim. Originally just called the Hollywood Cemetery, the establishment had a rough go of it in the beginning, mainly because the locals were opposed to it for the reasons that you would imagine. Because it was creepy. Or, more specifically, because they were worried it would bring a morbid sort of energy to the growing real estate market and drive down property values. This complaint actually resulted in a bit of legislation that attempted to revoke the association's right to build a cemetery. But ultimately, and obviously, they prevailed, and held their first burial in 1901. That of, you guessed it, Highland Mary Price. She was originally from Illinois, but married a man from Missouri named Thomas, and the two of them moved to the Hollywood area where Thomas opened a blacksmith shop. This, after all, was the pre-car times. As it would happen, Highland Mary would develop a brain tumor and die at the age of 34. As the legend goes, Highland Price was good friends with her neighbor Mary Mole, who, upon Highland's death, requested that the city name a street after her friend, in exchange for allowing them to expand that street through Mole's strawberry farm. They acquiesced, and the new road was dubbed Highland Avenue. So let's pay our respects to Highland Mary Price and Mary Gower, who is buried just a few feet away. May their parallel roads cut straight through the heart of Hollywood until California slides into the ocean. I would be remiss if I failed to mention that Mary Gower Street is also name-checked in that same Warren Zevon song I mentioned last season, though incorrectly as Gower Avenue. Anyway, let's get out of the sun and head into the large stone building with the large marble columns that you had no doubt noticed when we parked. That is the Cathedral Mausoleum, and it is the home of one of today's main topics of conversation. But before we get to him, let's talk a little bit about oil. You may already know this, but from the 1920s and into the 1940s, Los Angeles was one of the world's most voluminous oil-producing regions. And when the bottom finally fell out of that industry, no one fell quite as hard and as loud as a Canadian man by the name of Courtney Chauncey Julian, or CC, as he liked to be known. Born in 1885 to a man named Francis Julian, whose occupation is listed in census records as, quote, gentleman, CC's early life in Canada seems to be a series of odd jobs, from manual, quote, roughneck labor, to driving a milk wagon, to selling real estate, to working in a drugstore. None of this is terribly consequential except to say that Julian was a man who seemed to move from industry to industry like a shark, in constant search of the thing that was going to make him boatloads of easy money. And in Canada, it always seemed that the boom precipitated the bust. He would go through cycles of making a decent amount of money only to lose it all, and then repeat. So in 1921, he and his wife, daughters, and his mistress moved to Los Angeles, which was on the precipice of a tremendous oil boom. In the shadow of the city's first big gushers, discovered actually by Alfonso Bell, who would go on to develop Bel Air, Bell Gardens, etc. In the shadow of that future titan, Julian borrowed some money and bought a plot of land in Santa Fe Springs and began erecting derricks. And more importantly, selling stock in his future petroleum company. Initially, the Santa Fe Springs site did produce, which, along with flashy newspaper ads, stoked public investment interest. And CC was all too happy to issue those stock certificates. CC's shady business dealings are far too numerous to get into here, but suffice to say his downfall is a common story. In Ponzi scheme type fashion, he was issuing far more stock certificates than his wells could cover, and pocketing the overissuance, then using a portion of the new investor money to cover the stake of the original investors. Then the state started snooping around and felt that there was something fishy going on and suspended Julian's ability to issue new stock. This predictably sent the operation crashing down. That and a slew of other financial malfeasance. Lots of colorful stories surround the downfall of CC Julian. For instance, at a restaurant, he mistakenly bumped into a fellow diner. When that diner asked him to back up and give his party a little space, Julian responded by punching the diner, who then stood up and with one punch of his own, sent Julian to the floor unconscious. That fellow diner was none other than diminutive actor-director Charlie Chaplin. In a bloodier turn, banker and Julian cohort Motley Flint, a cohort who was chiefly responsible for signing up new investors, one of which was Louis B. Mayer, was shot to death in a courtroom by machinist Frank Keaton, who claimed that he lost $35,000 investing in Julian Petroleum. Julian cut his losses and moved to Oklahoma, where he tried to do the exact same thing he did in Los Angeles. This led to him being indicted by a grand jury. Julian, seeing the writing on the wall, skipped bail and fled to Shanghai. It was here that Julian would blow through the remainder of his funds on wild spending binges and ultimately commit suicide in 1934. And so ends the life of CC Julian. Now, you may be asking, what does this have to do with Hollywood Forever Cemetery? Well, Motley Flint, the man who was shot in the courtroom, he's buried here, but that's merely tangential. No, the big connection is that while C.C. Julian was operating his stock scam, his right-hand man was none other than Jules Roth. In fact, much like Julian, Roth, while wanted on 39 charges including grand theft and securities violations, fled ironically to Canada, using the name J. Chase. There he was arrested in Winnipeg, but following a court hearing, Jules Roth flew the coop through a door reserved for jurors, and basically disappeared for a little while. That is, until he turned up in New York and was finally extradited to Los Angeles. After a 1-month trial, Jules Roth was convicted on 21 of those counts and sentenced to 9 to 95 years in prison. So while his partner C.C. Julian was committing suicide in Shanghai, Jules Roth was cooling his heels in San Quentin. Lucky for Roth, he was out after 5 years, but upon his release, he found himself somewhat adrift. It was during that time, while visiting his parents' graves, that he decided he wanted to own the cemetery where they were buried. Why not get into the cemetery business, he thought. And that cemetery was, of course, the Hollywood Cemetery. He then began the lengthy process of buying out unhappy shareholders until he had amassed a 51% stake in the property, making him the de facto owner. It was from this position that he proceeded over the next 6 decades to run what was then called the Hollywood Memorial Park, the cemetery where his parents were buried, into the fucking ground. The stories of Jules Roth's tenure as the owner of Hollywood Forever Cemetery are pretty wild, but I will attempt to touch on the big ones. First and foremost, he upheld the cemetery's segregationist policies, forbidding non-whites from being buried in its grounds. This policy created a national stir in 1952 when Hattie McDaniel, of Gone with the Wind fame, passed away and, per her wishes, wished to be buried among her peers in the Hollywood Cemetery. Jules Roth said no. In the latter half of the 1950s, Roth purchased a yacht with company funds under the auspices of needing said yacht to scatter ashes at sea. He instead used the yacht for holding lavish parties. In fact, he wantonly pocketed and appropriated cemetery funds and earnings to fill his own coffers, to the point where a former employee tipped off the IRS, forcing Roth to sell some of the cemetery's land in order to pay down the tax debts. If you've ever been to Hollywood Forever and noticed a strip mall full of auto shops just outside the gates, that is where the original cemetery wall used to be. Moving on. Mama Cass Elliott, the eponymous mama of the Mamas and Papas, passed away unexpectedly in 1974. Her body was to be cremated at the Hollywood Cemetery, but the crematorium was in such disrepair that, mid-cremation, bricks and other debris began to fall from the building and pummel the body. Many of the crypts sustained water damage and fell into disrepair in the 1980s. In fact, in the 80s, this place sort of became disgusting. Tombs would regularly get broken into by people looking to score a morbid souvenir or two. Very popular amongst the city's burgeoning punk scene in West Hollywood. In 1986, 1,000 plot owners filed a class action lawsuit against Roth and the cemetery for invasion of privacy, after they discovered that Roth had allowed employees of the neighboring Paramount Pictures to park in the cemetery while the studio's parking structure was undergoing construction. In 1994, the Northridge earthquake made things even worse, and Roth was unable to pay to repair the damages.
There seems to be a lot of reports of damage and rock slides on the 14 freeway.
By then, the only money the cemetery was pulling in were $500 a pop disinterment fees, paid by families who wished to move their loved ones to other, less disgusting cemeteries. Jules Roth mercifully did not make it too much longer. In 1997, he became ill after he sustained a fall in his home. During this time, he was also fighting a second lawsuit involving another cemetery he owned, called Lincoln Memorial Park in Carson, California. Hundreds of families were suing him over poor record keeping and missing bodies. To make matters even more shady, several months before his death, Roth was bedridden and disoriented, and yet during this time his will was changed. His family members were written out, and instead, the will provided only for his business associates and maid, who, I'm sure coincidentally, were the only witnesses to his signature. Upon his passing, dozens of urns were found in his office containing the ashes of those who were meant to be buried at sea. But I guess that probably would have killed the mood at all those yacht parties. Jules Roth did finally die on January 4th, 1998, and he was initially dumped in an unmarked grave, but later moved to be with his wife and parents, right in the spot where we are currently standing. There's a bust of Jules Roth at the head of the aisle, which makes it pretty easy to find if you're looking. The bust initially resided in the office of Tyler Cassidy, who purchased the cemetery with his brother Brent for the paltry sum of $375,000. Descended from a wealthy line of cemetery proprietors, the brothers undertook millions of dollars in renovations to repair the grounds and transform Hollywood Forever into the cultural hub that it is today. Oh, and they also changed the name to Hollywood Forever. They also attempted to right one of the cemetery's most shameful wrongs by erecting a cenotaph for Hattie McDaniel in the Garden of Legends, though she herself still remains buried at Angeles Rosedale Cemetery. But history is like a circle, and sometimes the more things change, the more they stay the same. For the brothers Cassidy, the snake would finally catch its tail in 2010, when Brent Cassidy and his father James were indicted for running a Ponzi scheme, one involving the theft of more than $450 million from a funeral company they ran in Missouri. Through discovery, authorities determined that most of the money used to renovate Hollywood Forever and right the wrongs of Jules Roth came from this stolen money. both Brent and James pled guilty and were sentenced to 5 years in prison. The same amount of time that Roth had served for his role in the oil scam. James Cassidy was released early but passed away shortly thereafter. Brent sold his stake in the cemetery to the family trust, and now seems to be some sort of turn your life around style self-help guru. Tyler Cassidy was spared indictment and to this day remains the CEO of Hollywood Forever. So this is where we must say goodbye to Jules Roth. Was he a great guy? No, of course not. But he is by no means the worst person buried in this cemetery. But those are all stories for another time, so let's meet again next week, shall we? Same place, for a good old-fashioned Hollywood murder mystery. So until we meet again, watch out for the peacocks and drive safely. Between the Dial was written and produced by me, Daniel Watkins. If you like the music you're listening to, that's by Chestnut. And if you like horror movies, then myself and my wife, Christina, are hosting horror movies, vampire style, every Wednesday in September and October over on landturtlerecords.com. That's landturtlerecords.com. Also, please do write a review or rate this podcast if you could. It really does help us out. Have a good night.